I think the Dibbles and Oz group is fantastic. They're probably the most active Dibbles group out there. It's really heartening to see, that teachers helping teachers.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Zuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. How the world now measures early literacy growth. DIBELS, short for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, is a set of quick 1-minute fluency tests that help teachers pinpoint where students sit on the trajectory towards skilled reading from foundation to year 8. As schools increasingly turn to tools like Zuno Student Maps to aggregate DIBELS scores alongside PAT reading, NAPLAN and other assessments, Gina's work sits at the heart of both the science of reading and the practical challenge of turning data into equitable instruction. And in this conversation, we're going to trace the origin story of DIBELS, the growing uptake in Australia, and how thoughtful assessment design can support rather than obscure student agency. Dr. Gina Biancarosa, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into DIBELS proper, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect on your earliest memories of reading yourself. Was there a family member or a teacher who provided the spark? Do you have any recollection of your journey?
Great question. I haven't thought about that in a while. I guess one of my earliest memories is actually sitting with one of those Dick and Jane books. My mother used to buy us books from yard sales, and so I'm not old enough to have been taught with those books, but she bought a number of those books and they were in the house, and I remember just poring over them and really just being fascinated with, the interaction between the graphics and the words and, really trying to teach myself almost how to read the words. Reading was a big central sort of activity with my mother and my siblings when we were young. So she was always reading to us. So the idea that I would want to read was, a given.
It marries with, I was talking to an educator, a lecturer and researcher in education many years ago, and he said, look, there's so much we can do at school, but that parental model, that or not even just parental, but the people around you grow up with, humans learn through imitation. So I guess that gives you a stronger foundation than some children might have when you're blessed, I would say blessed because I love reading, with those sort of role models.
No, I totally agree. And, my mother wasn't highly educated, but she always had a good romance or mystery novel on her. And so, again, just that modeling of being engaged with reading, that was just a normal, everyday thing to do was really important, I think, in my upbringing.
Well, let's move to DIBELS now. And I wonder if you could take us back to the thinking that led to DIBELS, in particular the sort of problems in early reading assessment that you were trying to solve, you and your cohorts were trying to solve, and why did you land on short 1-minute fluency measures rather than lengthier comprehension tests? Discuss.
The folks who kind of came up with DIBELS, I was not around for the birth of DIBELS, but Mark Shin had this idea of what he called dynamic indicators of basic skills, or DIBS, and this idea that you might be able to develop some sort of an assessment system that would give you, in a very quick and dirty way, a sort of bead or read on how a student is doing in these sort of basic arenas. So real focus on early early learning at that time. And his colleague, who was at the U of O at the time, Roland Good, and some of his students really took that idea and ran with it. And that's sort of how DIBELS was born. And so the original subtests that came out were actually part of Ruth Kaminsky's. I'm not going to remember now if it was her master's thesis or her dissertation, but it was really born of a student product being led by University of Oregon faculty. And that problem space they were really trying to address was that existing literacy assessments really took a long time to administer. So there were lots of informal reading inventories. If you're familiar with those, they take a while because you're giving a child numerous lists of words, trying to find where their instructional and independent levels are and their frustration level, and then repeating that with passages and asking them questions about every passage they read. And so it could take a good half hour to an hour to assess a student with one of those inventories. And that just isn't really feasible in a classroom where you've got, 20, 30, even 40 kids in that you're responsible for.
There is so much nuance to just reflect on here. And part of it is, it struck me as you were saying this with those early steps into DIBELS, that humans had been reading for centuries before DIBELS came to be. We kind of got through. But is that broad brush kind of got through part of the problem? Some children weren't getting the support they were needing and therefore slipping through the cracks, whereas somehow the rest of us, maybe through role models around us, were able to muddle through. Was that the landscape in which DIBELS was born?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really important nuance to it that I didn't highlight, which is that the idea was that we aren't, and even today, we're still not reaching all learners. And so we needed tools that would enable us to identify who needs that extra boost in order to perform or learn to read and read with comprehension better. And so I think in years past, 100, 200 years ago, if you didn't get it, you didn't get it and you didn't move on. And there was a real shift, I would say, in the latter half of the 20th century where we were starting to have inclusive education, starting to really have higher expectations of all students. And this was very much, DIBELS was very much a tool for identifying the students who needed extra help and differing intensities of extra help in order to help them actually acquire reading.
I love that phrase you use, reading with comprehension, because ultimately that's the end game. To get to a point where you can rattle off the words is one thing, but to understand their context and perhaps a deeper meaning, now in this point in history more than ever, we need to have a deep ability to comprehend what's being said,
Right.
because there are subjects and there are people playing with our emotions and our intuitions. It's almost like it's more important now than ever it was. Unless I'm making too much of that, what do you think?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And for too long, there's been this perception, and I think there still is this perception in the general public that as long as you unlock the code, right, and you learn how to decode the words, comprehension will just magically happen. And that's really not necessarily the case. And it requires explicit instruction just as much as, learning to decode the words does to really make what is sort of a black box process in the head to illuminate that for young readers so that they understand that what seems automatic for their family members or their peers, that there's an actual method to how they're actually deriving meaning from what they read as they read.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning of Dibbles, there was this awareness that there were some early dynamic indicators of how children were faring, which leads to the other thing. You mentioned subtests as you were talking. Now, these
Mhm.
include things like letter naming fluency, nonsense word fluency, oral reading, etc. There's a number of them.
Mhm.
Can you explain how these subtests map onto the research of how children actually learn to read?
Sure. They very directly map onto that. I would say letter naming fluency is the one exception. Letter naming fluency is it's highly predictive of how well students learn to read by the end of third grade and even into their high school years or secondary school years. But it's not a skill that is a direct, so it's predictive, it's related to those outcomes, but it isn't causal, if you will. So just by teaching someone their letter names, they're not going to learn to read, right? Because you actually need to know the sounds associated with those letters in order to read. So we include letter naming fluency simply because it is easy to assess and highly predictive of later performance. In contrast, all of the other subtests are really part of what goes on in the head as we, take in printed words and try to turn them into language. And so phonemic segmentation fluency really gets at that association of sounds with letters, which is really one of the first, we call it the alphabetic principle. It's sort of one of the first key insights that one needs to have in order to be able to read. When we look at nonsense word fluency, that is tapping into the ability to associate those sounds with letters, but to do it in the context of a word. And so it expands the understanding a little bit to understanding the sounds that letters make based on their position in a word. And I'll digress for a moment to just say we use nonsense words because then what we don't have to worry about is that this is just a word from environmental print that a student has memorized and just knows, right? So a child might know the word. Let's say mum, right? You all call your mothers mum,
Yep.
and so they might recognize the word mum without understanding that the M says and the U says right? And so what we want to do is disassociate their oral vocabulary, if you will, or their sight word vocabulary from their ability to decode. We do assess their sight word vocabulary using the word reading fluency subtest. And that one uses those high frequency words like mum or even school, which is not particularly decodable. It kind of breaks a lot of rules.
Yes, yes. Ironic, isn't it?
Right, right. But it's a word that we do expect students to have been exposed to and to be able to recognize in print. So we have both that nonsense word fluency that gets at that decoding sort of engine, and word reading fluency, which gets at their sort of exposure to environmental print and high frequency words.
The nonsense in nonsense word fluency, I was thinking more Dr. Seuss coming up with nonsense words, but I'm taking it there's a different meaning to the way nonsense is being used here.
They are nonsense words. They're not real words, but they are decodable. So instead of the word mum, we might have a child experience the word mim, right? That's not a real word as far as I know, but it's decodable if you understand the sounds that M and the an I in the CVC position makes. Consonant, vowel, consonant, CVC. Yeah, they're made up words, and we tell children these are made up words, but we're going to ask you to read them just like you would read a real word. It's a task that some teachers really have a hard time with, but it's just very it gives us a lot of information about the student's ability to the degree to which they really understand those sound symbol correspondences and the letter and the spelling pattern, the spelling patterns themselves. So we start with consonant, vowel, consonant, but we get into like the silent E or the magic E, as it's often called, and other spelling patterns as well.
I get the image of acrobats practicing on the trapeze when you're playing with nonsense words, because you're just testing the limits and seeing how you get familiar and how you can work out where it's coming and get that feel for it. That's the image that you painted in my mind. And before I let you finish with that run you were on, I do thank you on behalf of Australian listeners that you said mum instead of mom, because Americans tend. Did you do that just for us because it was Australia? That was very
Yes.
nice. Oh, thank you. Now, were you going to say anything about oral reading fluency or the maze? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So oral reading fluency is really where the magic starts to come together, right? Where now we're not just reading words in isolation, we're reading them in connected text where that text has a meaning, and the student is supposed to be reading for meaning. And that's why at the beginning of the oral reading fluency subtest, we tell them we might ask you questions about this passage, so do your best reading. And most teachers don't ask questions. That's not part of the protocol. But the idea is to signal to the student that you do want them to be reading for meaning, not just reading as fast as they humanly can. And so what that measure gives us is a sense of usually a student can read faster with connected text than they can from a list, because you can start to predict what's coming next based on the meaning of what you're reading. And so we look for that sort of pattern as well, that a student is reading faster with connected text than they are reading from lists. And so that really represents, I guess, in terms of the developmental progression of reading, it's sort of like I said, that's where everything kind of starts to come together, so that our phonemic awareness is coming together with our ability to decode, but we're also starting to draw on those meaning-making skills. And then maze is the final subtest that we have, and maze is really getting at comprehension itself. And it's, I don't want to oversell it. It's not like a deep comprehension measure, so it's not going to get at a student's ability to analyze characters and their motivation, or the author's purpose in choosing these words, but it does get at their ability to understand sort of what should be in the passage based on what they already understand from the passage. And for those who don't know, a maze is where you take every sort of seventh or so word and you delete it, and you offer the reader three options, and they have to choose either the correct option, which is there, but then there are distractors that are the same part of speech. So we're not just testing their syntax knowledge, but then, they, in the upper grades, there might be some really seductive distractors that make sense overall with the passage, but not in the sentence proper, or the sentence where that deletion has occurred. And that enables us to, again, really get at the degree to which the students are able to make meaning as they're doing and going through the passage.
I love everything about that. I want to do that test. I'd be fascinated to see how I fare. And secondly, probably best that I'm not a teacher, because it would be a recipe for mischief if I was running that and coming up with the maze. But
Still juggling forms the old-fashioned way? Say hello to Student Forms by Zuno. You can create, collect and manage all your student forms online in one simple, secure platform. Save time, stay organised and quick access everything you need anytime. Visit zuno.com.au and see how Student Forms by Zuno can work for your school.
Gina, I'd love to just test my intuition with you, because when I was, as listeners know, I'm not a teacher. And so to hear that we've got 1 minute per subtest, it sounds remarkably fast. My intuition was, wow, this must be very superficial. Clearly it's not. There's a lot underneath the surface that's going on. How can these, what appear to me as brief measures, illuminate so much about the child's progress?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I don't think I've been asked that one before. I guess it's a minute is a lot longer than we think about, right? I mean, it's particularly for a beginning reader, a minute is a really long time to be trying to read, and particularly if they're struggling, right? And so the idea is we want to get just enough information to understand where they are in their growth trajectory. And so by assessing everyone for the same amount of time, we're able to kind of create norms that allow us to see where a student falls relative to their peers, but also to see how their score pans out in terms of predicting how they might do on a more comprehensive measure of reading at the end of the year. So our cut scores on the measures are based not on the norms and that sort of compared to peers data, but rather on predicting to a much more comprehensive measure that takes longer to administer. So one of these measures that does a more complete job of getting at reading, particularly reading comprehension, because as you said it sort of at the beginning, reading for meaning, that is the whole purpose, right? If we're just decoding words and we're not getting any meaning out of them, we're not really reading in the way that most of us mean the word reading. And so it turns out that these really brief measures can be very strongly predictive of how you do on a more complex measure. And so they're not designed to replace those more complicated or comprehensive measures. They're really designed so that we don't have to give those measures multiple times during the year to have a sense of how a student is making progress towards end of grade or end of year goals.
So does that mean a teacher could apply a DIBELS testing scenario at a number of times, because it is so short, to track without the heavier enterprise?
Yes, exactly. So DIBELS is designed to be administered 3 times per year, the beginning of the school year, the middle of the school year, and then again at the end of the school year. At each time point, the cut scores that we use are always predicting to how they perform at the end of the school year. So we're trying to identify and again give a boost to students who are really at risk of not meeting grade level goals.
With my teacher's hat on now, if I'm generating this content, I believe schools can use DIBELS through the University of Oregon, the Amplify ecosystem, I think it is. Some can just run Excel-based spreadsheets. I also know there are integrated tools like Zuno Student Maps, etc. They have capacity to capture this data. How would you hope a teacher is interacting with that data as the year progresses? What's that connective tissue look like?
Right. Well, this is so you highlighted it's really important to know the measures are available for free, and you can create your own Excel spreadsheets, and there's lots of people in Australia and South Australia and beyond who have created these kinds of spreadsheets for informing decision making. But there are two data-based decision-making systems that are available, both offered by Amplify Education. One is called the DIBELS data system, and this is one where you just enter in the scores based on your paper-based administration of the measures, and you get back all kinds of reports. And then there's the M-class system, which actually has digital administration, so it does the scoring for you. And the advantage of both of those systems over using an Excel spreadsheet is that they have access to what we, for lack of a better term, are growth norms. And so we actually have a lot of statistics sort of under the hood, if you will, where based on how a student does at the beginning of the year, we can project for you what how much they should improve by the middle of the year or the end of the year, based on sort of what other students with that same start score have done historically. And then that way, when you're giving these multiple administrations, you're able to really compare how a student is doing to those growth norms and determine, are they making adequate progress, or do I need to up the support to make sure that they actually hit the goals that we have for them? So the ideal interaction with the data would be to use it to set goals and to monitor how well students are making progress towards those goals.
I love it. It's illuminating the whole pathway, not just having little spotlights that you visit throughout the year.
Exactly.
Now, you did mention South Australia, which, as listeners might know, is my home state. Queensland, I also believe there's a lot of DIBELS usage there. Can you remember what the initial pathways were that led DIBELS into Australian schools? Have you got any recollection of that? Was there a champion or two that took it and ran with it? Or what took place?
Well, there's a University of Oregon alum who is in Australia named Sarah McDonough, and she has been a true champion of DIBELS and has done tons of professional development around the country to help teachers learn about the system, learn how to administer the measures and implement the system as intended. My own personal involvement with Australia actually began with South Australia. The government reached out to me to ask about whether we had ever considered creating an Australian version of DIBELS, one that matched the spelling and vocabulary differences that we have between America and Australia. And we were thrilled at the idea that this might, help with uptake and just face validity for teachers, right? So instead of mom, we use mum. Instead of color ending in an OR, it ends in an OUR, just to make it a little bit less strange for children who were actually being assessed with the measures. And so we ended up partnering with the South Australia government to have them review all of our materials and flag places where we need to change the spelling or come up with a different vocabulary word, or even adjust the syntax a little bit. There are ways that we say things in the US that aren't exactly the same way you say them in Australia. And so they were really instrumental in our ability to support what we call the Australasian version. We call it Australasian because we subsequently got contacted by Emma Nana in New Zealand, that she was undertaking this kind of an adaptation herself for the New Zealand context. And the spellings and vocabulary differences they're pretty similar in New Zealand compared to Australia, at least for the measures that we have.
Their vowels are all over the place, and they won't mind me saying that.
Yes, so it was really a collective endeavor, and one of my wish list items for the years to come is to have DIBELS, the M-class version of DIBELS support the Australasian version. Right now, it only supports the American version of DIBELS, but as I said, the most of the changes are relatively minor. We tried very hard to keep the versions as parallel as possible. And one of the things that we did, or that we encouraged the South Australian government to do, was to study, like, how did students perform when we give them the American version versus when we give them the Australasian version. And so they basically assessed a goodly amount of children with one version and another group of students with the other version, and found that the scores were very parallel.
I guess that makes sense. I was kind of expecting the Australianised one to be more natural, more at home, but these are readers at the beginning of their journey, so they probably haven't got built-in prejudice yet or patterns.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think that particularly in those early grades, a lot of the spelling differences don't show up as much because we're dealing with much shorter, words. If you think of nonsense word fluency, in kindergarten, we only test those consonant, vowel, consonant words. In first grade, we go to silent E and R controlled vowels and some consonant digraphs and blends, but those aren't places where our spelling patterns differ really very much. So it's really only in, like, I would say, grade 3 and beyond where those differences start to make a bigger difference in the testing experience. But regardless of whether statistically there was a difference between how students performed, I would argue that there is that more sort of naturalness to the Australasian version for students in Australia, that they're not constantly encountering these, words that are just a little off in how they're spelled, or, a little strange because it's referencing an animal that maybe isn't in my vocabulary. So I'm trying to remember what I think instead of squirrel, we came up with I can't remember the mammal right.
Possum?
Maybe we might have substituted possum for squirrel in one of our passages. But just even little details like that, just to make it a little bit less strange for them.
I do love the fact that South Australia has worked with you, because South Australia exported Rupert Murdoch, whose News Corporation, we might argue, favourably has simplified the use of language. There are other terms I could use, and now it's coming back the other way, but I won't ask you to comment on that. When I first saw the word, though, I need to check this. This could be a mini 30-second lesson for me. I wanted to say DIBELS because there wasn't a double consonant, which would shorten the vowel for me. And so when there's only one consonant, I would tend to lengthen the vowel. What was my intuition doing wrong there? Or is this one of those quirks?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that if we were using our spelling rules, it would be DIBELS. But for whatever reason, I think it's because it started as DIBS, DIBS. And then it got expanded out into DIBELS, that it was just the way that people internal to the U of O referred to it, and it just stuck. But I agree with you that if we were putting it on a nonsense word test, it should probably be DIBELS. Yeah.
Are there any subtle techniques around phrasing, timing, or even the environment that would make a big difference to both the reliability of the data and the child's experience of being assessed?
That is a fantastic question. So we strongly recommend that people get training in how to administer the measures. We try to make them stand alone. So we've got our administration and scoring guidelines. But I would say that, 90% of the questions that we see out there on social media about administering and scoring the measures are issues that are answered in the administration and scoring guide. And I think it's just overwhelming to have to read a manual and translate that into practice versus if you attend a training and you're kind of learning in chunks and practicing as you go. I just think it's a much more supportive way of learning how to administer and score the measures. As well as how to deal with the data on the back end, which we don't have a ton of support around. I will acknowledge that. Yeah.
On the data, I know there are people at Zuno Student Maps leaning forward, wanting to get your answer on this one. If we look ahead 5 or 10 years, how would you like to see DIBELS integrated into broader school-level data systems? Is it enough to be using the Amplify ecosystem, or do you see that it's set up and it's ripe for other forms of integration?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that very much. I do think that the Amplify systems support the intended uses of DIBELS very, very well. We have all kinds of reports that the University of Oregon really has done a lot of work around to study and understand which reports teachers find the most useful. And so the reporting options that are available in the DIBELS data system and the M-class system are really pretty high leverage reports. I worry a little bit about it being integrated. I mean, it should be integrated into the assessment ecosystem, if you will, of a school or a district. But I often worry that people start to use the scores to inform decisions they weren't originally designed to inform. And so one of those that's a hot topic in the US is using them to understand teacher productivity or as an accountability measure. And that really starts to be problematic because these are all fluency measures, and there's a point at which faster is no longer better. And when you put it into an accountability system, it assumes that higher scores are always better. And there really is sort of, if we picture a curve, a sort of leveling off of that curve, an asymptote that limits the information we're going to get on those higher ability readers.
That is so important with comprehension, isn't it? Because my wife gobbles books at the rate of the speed of light, and I do wonder how much nuance has she skipped over. She's going to listen to this, and I'll get the feedback that I'm probably talking outside of school. But there is, I think that's a beautiful point. The whole thing that you've explained with DIBELS is there's nuance, and we're looking for those dynamic indicators. And so we can't treat it as a blunt tool. It's got its focus. It's got its purpose.
Exactly.
DIBELS in Oz is a group, a club that's formed. There are the teachers involved in this. I guess there are others experimenting with things. What do you think? Does that surprise you that this ecosystem is sort of bubbling out with these different outposts and cohorts of educators working together?
I guess, 20 years ago, it would have surprised me, but I think with social media these days, people find their people, right? And so I think the DIBELS and Oz group is fantastic. They're probably the most active DIBELS group out there in terms of what goes on in social media, and it's really heartening to see that teachers helping teachers and answering each other's questions and being very thoughtful about it. I lurk on Facebook quite a bit. And I usually don't have to weigh in because the teachers who know their stuff are right there helping their peers. And so I think it's fantastic and really thrilled with the uptake and the sort of community that people have built around DIBELS.
I want to close with your personal reflection on gratitude for being able to read and comprehend things, because last night with my 15-year-old, we finished watching the 2025 movie Frankenstein, which is so dense and thoughtfully made. It's whetted my appetite to dive back into Mary Shelley and read the book again. I've recently been on a sojourn of reading Russian classics by Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and I am so thankful that I can stick with it and wade through it. Are there any works of literature or any other application of reading in your world, Gina, that you're grateful for being able to, as I think I used off air talking about this interview, suck the marrow out of the thoughts and the writings of others?
Yeah, I am absolutely grateful. I often, reflect on the fact that reading has been such a central part of my life, from very early on, and I've always looked at it as a real gift. And I've been an avid reader from the get-go. My siblings and I would come back from the library with, the maximum number of books that you were allowed to check out each time. And I just remember pouring through them in terms of particular works, gosh, I have so many favorites. Jane Eyre is a real favorite. What else? This is more kiddie, but the Anne of Green Gables series was just one that I read obsessively as a youngster. I don't know if it's. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yes, it's big.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it had crossed the pond or not.
Yes.
I've always seen it as a gift, and so one of the things that I did as a college student was I was a reader for the blind, and because I saw it as such a gift, and I thought, well, if I can help someone else be able to read, where they literally wouldn't have access to the text without someone to aid them. I was really thrilled to see that was a volunteer opportunity when I was an undergrad, and really enjoyed doing that. Although the things that I had to read were about politics and in the Middle East, which was where I didn't know what I was reading half the time.
Oh, wow.
At the time, anyway. I understand a lot more now.
My colleague in my day job is blind, so he consumes audiobooks. And I have learned that what you just did is such a beautiful act. And some people are better readers than others. Stephen Fry does the works of Sherlock Holmes beautiful. He just didn't want it to stop, etc. And so there it is again. And DIBELS is at the beginning of this pathway to ensure that others can have the sort of little fun reflection you and I just did. Dr. Gina Biancarosa, thank you very much for joining me around the school table.
It's my utter pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.